Thank you so much, Paula. I am thrilled to be able to do a third week with all of you. Canada is one of my favorite places to visit and spend time, and I love talking about wine with my friends in Canada as well. Now, I noticed that I think it was Mega asked about the recording for last week's session. If you do a search in YouTube for California wines and Chardonnay, it should come up. But Danielle or Paula can actually put a link in the chat window for the YouTube channel for the California Wine Institute to help you get it. Anyone that was registered for last week's session will also be receiving an email that has a link to the recording. But please feel free to send an email or send a note asking for that again if you need it. Okay, I'm super excited to do today's session. We get to talk all Pinot all day long. And the thing about California Pinot is that we of course all realize Pinot is grown literally all over the world now. And so regions around the world have Pinot growing in all sorts of different conditions. But California is really uniquely positioned in that we have California planted the entire length of the state, certainly along the coastal areas and some of the inland areas as well. And more than any other region in the world, California is able to showcase what Pinot has to offer when grown in different soil types and different climate conditions. And that's the kind of thing that we're going to get to taste through today and talk about. But we're also going to really talk about the history of styles and trends in the state and get into winemaking a little bit. I'm really thrilled about the group of winemakers we have today. They're really superstars in Pinot, really extensive experience with this particular variety in the state. And so we just have a real wealth of insight to share today. Now, Greg Brewer, I was hoping to start with you because the truth is you have been working with Pinot Noir since the early 1990s. You got started in one of California's undersung but absolutely classic wineries, Santa Barbara Winery. It's less talked about now, but it's really played an important historical role in the state. And then by the mid 1990s, you were already getting Brewer Clifton started and making Pinot. And so that's really a history, a lifetime of experience with the variety here in California. And I was hoping just to get us started, you could briefly comment on the evolution you've seen of Pinot in California.
Of course, like the old forefather. Yeah, before electricity and everything else. There's something good to be said for age, I guess. But yeah, it's so funny, like wine years are like the opposite of dog years. You know what I mean? Like things take so long to evolve and kind of gain traction. And it's really interesting if you think about it. When I started in 91 at Santa Barbara, Pinot was pretty esoteric. I mean, certainly down here in Santa Barbara. And yes, it was produced and there was Sanford and there's Babcock, et cetera. But it was still very super under the radar. I mean, the fruit prices were like $900 a ton. I mean, it was less expensive than anything else. It was kind of like people were figuring it out. And then, of course, there were those people, William Sellium, Calera, what an honor to be with Mike today, like Dellinger, those producers and others, I'm not trying to single people out, in California that were like heroes, but they were heroes of something pretty finite and very, very kind of acute in scope. And it's been so fascinating starting, in the mid 90s, with that kind of swelling up of circumstance down here anyway, I think throughout the whole state. And the evolution and the acceleration of the grape variety throughout the world and certainly up and down, these corridors of the state has been a fascinating thing to witness and be a part of.
I think it's so important to just kind of start us with that historical reminder, because I think Pinot in California are so taken for granted now that it's easy for people to either forget or just not have realized that it's actually very, very recent that Pinot has taken such a dominant role in the state. We don't know the exact date that it arrived in California. We know it was here by the late 1800s. Just as an interesting side note, Ridge Lytton Springs has a single Pinot Noir vine planted in its field blend, really close to the winery. And we do know that we can date that individual Pinot Noir vine to 1901. So we've had Pinot in the state for quite a while, but interestingly enough, we don't know the exact date it arrived. But as Greg was just describing, it didn't really start to take off until into the 1990s. And then it becomes a more dominant force in the mid 2000s. And so that is profoundly recent. And yet it is a really celebrated variety for the state now. And we have really gained so much insight about how the variety can do in different types of growing conditions. And I think California has really uniquely increased the understanding of the variety for the world. So let's go ahead and start looking at the different wines that we're going to talk about and the regions that they give us insight into. And so Celeste is, again, doing a beautiful job running PowerPoint behind the scenes for us. It's important to remember how much work is done behind the scenes in any of these programs. So thank you for that, Celeste. If we could just pull up the first map. We always start here. We just want to remind ourselves where we're located. Big, broad California map. This is a great map because it really kind of shows the broad growing regions for California. The key to know here is that North Coast and Central Coast, right up there against the western side of the state, those are the key broad growing regions for California Pinot Noir. Interestingly enough, though, there's Pinot planted all the way through the inland valleys or central valleys. There's some that has been emerging in the far north up there near Mount Shasta. There is a little tiny bit in Southern California, but not a lot. And so really what we're going to do today is go down those corridors through the coast as Greg mentioned. And let's go ahead and start with the first map all the way up in Mendocino. So we saw this map last week, and the reason to bring this map in is to really remind us where we're talking about for these first wines. And so you can see the yellow outline is the North Coast AVA. As a basic reminder, the North Coast AVA is defined by being north of San Francisco and San Pablo Bay, and notice it hugs the Pacific Ocean all the way up. It includes Mendocino and Lake counties in the north, Sonoma County and Napa Valley kind of in the middle area, and parts of Marin and Solano counties in the southernmost part. Now, we're going to look, though, today at Anderson Valley AVA, and you can see it's outlined in blue. And the key thing about this particular valley, and we'll talk about it more in a second, but notice how incredibly far north it is. It is almost the northern boundary of the North Coast, and it really is, it's about the 38th latitude. It's very, very far north in terms of being able to grow grapes in Mendocino County and in the North Coast. And part of why is that northern part where the red pointer is on right now is actually the start of a canyon at the northernmost part of the AVA that is open all the way to the ocean. Now, the thing that we've talked a lot about the last two sessions is how there is a really powerful ocean current that starts in the north and goes all the way south along the California coast, all the way down to Santa Barbara County, and then it swoops out into the ocean again. And that current is a powerful current, which means it has a really strong influence on any of the land nearby it, and it's incredibly cold. And that is why if you're going to try and go surfing in Northern California, you had better wear a really nice thick wetsuit, or it's going to be too cold. You could actually go hypothermic. It's cold enough for that. So the fact that Anderson Valley opens to the ocean is a really important element of growing in that area. And so let's go ahead and just start right away with the first wine. We could see the wine slide for this first wine. Now, just like last time with Chardonnay, we were very intentional about the wine selection for this week because we wanted a real big range of price points, styles, and regions all together. And so we start with Goldeneye, and Goldeneye is a classic producer for Anderson Valley. Modern vines go into Anderson Valley in the 1960s, and by 1983, it was already recognized as an AVA. But for Pinot Noir, around 96, vines really start to take off. So mid-1990s, people really start to consider Anderson Valley as a perfect growing area for Pinot Noir. And Goldeneye was actually founded in 1996. So it really speaks to this kind of Pinot Noir history for Anderson Valley. People like to ask about clones for Pinot. I will happily list them. I'm not going to dwell on the clone conversation, though, because there's plenty to read about it. So let's talk about other things. But this particular wine has over 20 clones, a mix of Dijon and heritage selections from around the state of California. It was aged 16 months in 60% new all French oak, and importantly comes from the northern part of Anderson Valley, which locally is called the deep end. It is called the deep end because it is closest to the ocean and most inundated with fog. So it's like really deep in those cool growing conditions. So let's go ahead and I'm really excited. All of the panelists have the wines, and so we can just kind of taste and talk through them all together. And I'm going to just call on different people because I love getting the whole panel to talk all the way through. It's a lot of fun. I know some people that are participating in the tasting don't have the golden eye, so we'll get the panel to talk about it. And then we wanted to be sure that Anderson Valley is well represented. And so Megan is able to talk to us also about Walt, which we'll get into in a second. But Paul, I'd just love to draw on you. You're in another area that's so profoundly influenced by ocean fog. And I know you were saying it's really foggy there in the Santa Lucia Highlands this morning, but now Anderson Valley is much, much further north. Are there any things as you taste this wine that really stand out to you?
The red cherry, definitely hitting a note close to home on that. And it's, it's got a really, when I tasted it, it's got a really nice balanced acidity, definitely not acidity problem up there. It's very, I also getting some good oak influence on it too. Even though it's like 60%, which would be kind of considered high, it's holding it really well.
Yeah, for me, the acid and the spice really kind of marry each other. They sort of interbraid. And so it's, so if you're looking for it, you can definitely see the oak, but it doesn't feel thick, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Greg, for some reason you're appearing on my screen twice, but speaking to one of you, at least, Greg Morthole, comments again, you're in Sonoma County, Russian River Valley, and parts of Sonoma County are really influenced by wind. Parts of Anderson Valley can get that way as well. Are there things that stand out to you about this wine as you taste it?
Yeah, I agree with Paul on a number of things, really. I mean, I like that cherry. I find the fruit to be on that spectrum. I mean, you can have fruit that's fresher, you can have fruit that's reddish, bluish sometimes, dark, and you can have it be fresher, or you can have it be kind of in dried character. My grandma used to make dried, fruit roll-ups, like homemade fruit roll-ups, and you can kind of get that character in some wines. This one for me is on the fresher end of the spectrum, so I totally agree with Paul on that cherry, and I get a little blueberry and a little bit of a dusty character, which I think it might be coming from the grapes or probably a marriage between that and the oak, but to me, it does taste like a wine that is reminiscent of, closer to home, reminiscent of the cooler parts of Sonoma County, which is out in Green Valley and the Sebastopol Hills, where you have the fresher fruit tones and the slightly leaner body, just beautifully so, just very well balanced that way. I think of that deep end northern part of Anderson Valley as really an intersection of kind of wind, water, and fog. The Navarro River plays a really important role there. The fog can be quite thick, as we said, and in those northernmost parts, the wind can really take off. And I really get that kind of the freshness that you're talking about. Windy areas and foggy areas to me often have that kind of high tone element. And for me, Anderson Valley Pinot tends to be really, red but high tone. And also there's that kind of northern forest freshness or warmth that is so classic to this area as well. Let's go ahead and compare that now to the Walt. If we could go ahead and see the second Anderson Valley map, we'll zoom in just a little bit more now that we know where we're talking about. And you can see we kind of pared this map down, and Anderson Valley AVA is outlined in red there. What you want to notice though is that all of those dark green areas, those are all forest covered mountaintops. So notice how it's very rugged. Elevation plays a really important role. Kind of the first vineyards to go into Anderson Valley really went kind of more valley floor and benchlands, but in more recent years, in the last decade, people have started to plant up the slopes as well. But now you can kind of almost get a hint here. Celeste is highlighting the northern corner and the northern line of the AVA. But if you kind of zoom west from that, there is just a really faint river valley line. The Navarro River again flows all the way to the ocean, and it creates a river canyon that sucks in cold air off the ocean, and that's where all the fog influence comes from. And so really importantly, Anderson Valley is very maritime influenced, and that plays a key role in how the wines show up in this area. But if we could go to, we'll go ahead and pull up the Walt wine
slide as well. And Megan, you know, you're in an interesting position with Pinot Noir because you, of course, make this particular Blue Jay Pinot from Anderson Valley. But one of the things that defines Walt as a winery is working with Pinot the entire length of the California coast, all of North Coast and all of Central Coast. So you really are getting a firsthand look at how fruit comes in from around the state. And I was hoping you could comment briefly on how Anderson Valley stands out to you in relation to those other parts of the state that you work with.
Sure. Well, in particular, in this part of the Anderson Valley, I mean, we're really at the entrance to the Anderson Valley with our estate vineyard called the Corners, and also Donnelly Creek, which are the two main sources of this wine. And it's a little bit warmer there. So this tends to be one of the first areas that I see come in for Pinot Noir, Napa Carneros, and then Anderson Valley. I think because of where we are, it's a little bit farther removed from the ocean, slightly warmer. But what we haven't talked about yet is the huge diurnal temperature shift that you have in the Anderson Valley. So when I head up there in the morning, it's about 2.5 hours north of the winery here in Sonoma. When I head up there in the morning, it's usually about 70 degrees when I get there at 7 or 8. By the time I leave at noon, it can be well over 100 degrees. The temperature comes up very quickly and then drops quickly in the afternoon. So what that means in this area is you really have to watch those vineyards, especially around the 1st of September. Labor Day, we usually get a heat spike, but you get a lot of really nice, round, rich, supple fruit from the warmer daytime temperature. And then from the fog and the lower temperature at night, you get a beautiful vibrancy and acidity and a freshness in the wine. So for me, I think that Anderson Valley is also an earthier expression. We talked about forest floor. I get a lot of mushroom, maybe a little bit more blue fruit direction, where in Sonoma, I think for me, there's more red fruit. Santa Lucia Highlands, also, you know, beautiful ripeness, more cranberry, but great acidity. And then down into Santa Rita Hills, you get, you know, vibrant red fruits and that really incredible soil type that I think influences the flavors in those wines. So it's really fun to see the differences throughout California. It's also important to note that all of the vineyards that we're working with sit very close to the opening of the Pacific Ocean. Mm-hmm. Pinot Noir likes to be cooler, likes well-drained soils, limiting soils. And that's really kind of the common thread for me between all of the appellations that we're working with.
Yeah, that's great. And the you know, we talked last time about the role that fog plays in California, and that's really true as we move through the different regions for Pinot today as well. And we've spoken a lot in the last 2 sessions about the way that these like tightly focused inland valleys that we have through the whole coastal range of California, you know, as temperatures go up in the area furthest from the ocean, that's what creates that vacuum effect that really pulls in the cold ocean air and fog. And so Anderson Valley is just another example of that. California's coastal regions are really defined by that very rugged, textured landscape of the coastal mountain range. And, you know, if you think about mountains, they're you know, really varied. The elevations begin to play an important role. But in all these Google Maps we keep looking at, you can see they're covered in trees. And the kinds of forests we have in the northern parts of California create their own weather systems. They actually influence and moderate the temperatures that Megan was just describing. So now in contrast to the first wine, this wine, Megan, my understanding is that it was aged for 10 months in 40% new French oak. So less new oak influence and less oak aging as well. And the clonal selection, there's a kind of, my understanding is just a little bit of Dijon clone and then a few heritage clones as well. Is that right?
It's mostly Dijon clone. And then we do have some heritage clones coming from the Donnelly Creek Vineyard, those heritage selections. Something else that we do that's really interesting with this wine in our winemaking is rather than a traditional whole cluster fermentation, which is very popular in Pinot Noir winemaking, where you actually will ferment the whole cluster in the tank, we actually destem and then add back roasted stems at about 50% of the original weight. So we destem, we rinse the stems to remove any sugar because I don't want any charring or burning of those stems. And then I put them in a very large commercial chili roaster over a very low flame. And then you slowly turn the drum of the chili roaster and you change the tannin structure in those stems. They go from being very green and crisp to more brown and pliant. And I think there's a nice spiciness, baking spice aroma that comes from that process. And what that does is just add a little bit more tannic lift for me without the other things that come from whole cluster fermentation. So we do have stem inclusion. It adds a nice tension and length to the palate. And so that's something that is unique for us to this wine. And I think it really works well in Anderson Valley, which I sometimes find to be a little bit lacking in tannin. And that's been something that we've developed over many years through lots of research. But it's a fun story to tell and something that works well with this wine.
Right. And it's important to point out that the role of stem inclusion, as Megan was just describing, is really quite different in its effect on a wine than the role of whole cluster fermentation, which we'll talk about a little bit more later as well. And so it's really quite a unique process that Walt does in that regard. But Mike, I'd love to hear from you. I know you have both of the Anderson Valley wines, and so I'd love to hear kind of what stands out to you in tasting the Walt and the contrast you see in relation to the Goldeneye as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think both of these wines are really a texture-driven wines. I'm getting a lot of that. I find the Walt fruit to be almost more in the red fruit characteristics, even kind of a little more spice. But really, I think both of these wines really kind of depict a great little show of what Anderson Valley is about, because I mean, I think they have very similar qualities in that standpoint as far as texture goes.
Well, and lots of length, and almost the acidity to me is interesting because it's almost creamy somehow. Like there's tons of length from the acid, but it's like really diffused edges on it at the same time. Sometimes acid can be almost searing and sharp edged, and this is really a softer edge, but really lengthy acid at the same time. Greg, are there, you, and we'll talk about it more later once we get to your wine, but you have been kind of a stalwart advocate for whole cluster and really have so much experience working with whole cluster. And again, the approach that Megan just described is a completely different one than whole cluster fermentation. So I'm really curious to hear like what stands out to you in tasting this wine, where you're seeing the stem inclusion in this particular way rather than the whole cluster that you tend to do.
For sure.
Well, I mean, go ahead, Greg.
So I remember, the first time I heard Megan make reference to that at a tech symposium thing, I thought that was like the coolest concept ever. And I'm so happy. I'm like smiling like ear to ear that you all still do that. I think that's awesome. The thing I'm going to kind of pick up where Mike kind of explored a little bit that I found really compelling. I mean, what's not to like about, all these wines, but the Walt really, like, it's so precise. It's so disciplined. It's so pristine. And it's so beautiful because then, when Megan was referencing kind of the warmer part, so to speak, within context, obviously in Anderson Valley. And so you've got this warmth and richness, but then it's all like channeled and lifted and rendered so precise by that craftsmanship ultimately, and that kind of mindful approach to it. It's just beautiful. It's like this beautiful equilibrium of circumstances. And that's hard to accomplish, that kind of hourglass pendulum swing thing. And it's so beautifully articulated. It's really a special wine.
I thank you for saying that, Greg. I think one of the things that this wine really demonstrates is how important it is to taste the wine genuinely. Like, so there are, being on the wine media, wine trade side myself, I'm going to call my brethren out on some things that I know are common. Like sometimes it's really easy for wine trade and wine media to come in and make assumptions that are like, oh, she said it's warmer, or oh, the alcohol's this, or oh, the oak percentage is that. And to think we know before we've even tasted the wine what is going on with that wine. And I think that the Walt is a really beautiful example of how the careful attention that Megan described bringing to the vineyard, and then the craftsmanship in the cellar are really what determine that kind of focus and tension in the wine. And so you're getting, some beautiful natural spice here, and again, that really lengthy acidity, and it's all in really nice focus. And so that's why as tasters, we need to come to the wine tasting rather than preloading so-called wine facts and determining our response based on that. But Mike, it sounded like you were about to respond earlier. Did you want to add something else?
Yeah, we were just asked, you were talking about whole cluster, and obviously, that's what we've traditionally done here is really 100% whole cluster. And I don't think it works for every place, and it maybe doesn't work for all Dijon clones. You need some kind of exposure to your rachis, and I think you need long hang time and really to get those stems ripe. So this is a great way to probably bring in some more tannin, some more structure to the wine. If you don't have the luxury of just putting in wine into a whole bunch in the lot, we just lucked out. Plus, it sounds like a lot of work to me.
Yeah. No, I think that point is really.
I think it's awesome.
Well, and we'll see that contrast as we go into the other regions. That some regions that the stem condition just doesn't lend itself to inclusion, and Megan and the Walt team have come up with a way to adjust that a little bit. So let's keep going.
But super fast though. If we can just one more little tiny thing about the Walt approach is that how awesome too to explore and to exploit like something within your own system in that way. It's like nose to tail cooking or something. It's like, okay, well, we've got these stems, let's like massage them so that we can like find what we need from within what we already have. That's amazing. That's such a beautiful approach, I think.
Well, it's a good point too of like working with your region, because Anderson Valley wines can be quite light, as Megan was saying. And sometimes when people have a region that naturally generates less tannin or lighter fruit, people will say, oh, well, we'll increase the oak aging and the oak percentage. And that's certainly one thing that can work, but it leads into a particular style of wine. And Megan said, no, we're going to make this other style and we're going to approach it in this other way, like Greg's saying. So it's like developing your techniques. Okay, great. Let's look at Russian River Valley. Celeste, if we could pull up the Sonoma County map. This map is a little goofy, but I just love how textural it is. So it's actually a photo of a topographical 3-dimensional map. And I love when I encounter these because you can feel the landscape and then really see it. And so in this case, all the white areas are the high elevation coastal mountains. What you can see on this map, though, is how profoundly mountainous Sonoma County and the entire north coast of California truly are. Right there in the middle, Celeste can circle where the Russian River Valley AVA is. It's really pretty much in the middle of Sonoma County. But you'll notice that towards the bottom of the Russian River Valley AVA, there's the mountains really soften, and it's exposed. That southern boundary line of Sonoma County is actually exposed to the ocean because there's a very, very low spot in the coastal range. And so all of that ocean influence and really cold maritime fog come all the way into Sonoma County and push all the way into the Russian River Valley. And so, Greg, speaking from Rodney Strong, you have influence making Pinot from all over Sonoma County. Russian River Valley really is its, I think, historically most well-known area. And Russian River Valley is really one of the regions that helped show California could make great Pinot. And I know there was a little bit of a sound issue that some people said they were having hearing you earlier. So if you don't mind speaking up a bit, if you could just comment briefly on not just Russian River Valley, but how you see it in contrast to other growing areas of Sonoma County, because we have Pinot Noir, all through the coastal mountains. You work with a lot of fruit from Petaluma Gap, one of the newer AVAs in California as well. And then Russian River Valley is one of California's important historic AVAs. So if you could kind of speak to the contrast you see around the county, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, speak up just a touch more and then we'll be great.
Speak up a touch more and we'll pull this a little closer too.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Oops, I think you accidentally hit mute on your mic though.
No.
Okay, great.
Okay? All right.
Yeah.
The Russian River became famous, thankfully for us a while ago, although I like what Greg was saying about the how new things are, really. It's kind of, grapes were planted here a long time ago. I think Buena Vista 1856 or 1857, and Pinot Noir a long time ago as well. And things changed and revolved. But yeah, we're now in the modern era, and really progressed through the 80s, and the appellation became named as much in 1983 when they named a bunch of appellations, at least up here. I'm not sure about down in the Central Coast and Anderson Valley, but the Russian River Valley is a big, broad, expansive valley. And having said that, only 6% of wines from Sonoma County as a whole, you know, mindful that we also have all these wonderful cabs and zins and all these things from Alexander Valley, Dry Creek Valley, Sonoma Valley, and all these other places. 6% of wines from California as a whole come from Sonoma County, so it's not that much. If you take it down to the Russian River, there's probably, I guess, the lion's share, or maybe a really solid chunk of the wineries are located in the Russian River. It's about, I think, almost 500. And so a lot of small growers. You know, we're a larger grower winery, but a lot of small ones, medium-sized ones as well. So the valley itself, big and broad, and so we've kind of informally carved it up into some neighborhoods. It's not to chase making appellations other than what already exists. There's the Green Valley and there's Chalk Hill, but we have 6 different areas that we like to focus on, and they are quite different. And it's based mostly, I would say, on temperature and the wind and the fog, like you mentioned, coming up through the Petaluma Gap. If you look towards the coast, Sonoma County has a lot of coastline. There's that part that kind of has that little arm that hooks down. That's the Bodega Head. And as you know, and so that wind channels through that Petaluma Gap. If it wasn't for that, the Russian River as a whole would be a lot warmer, no doubt. And so we do get a nice diurnal shift, as Megan mentioned, up in Anderson Valley. It does affect us quite a bit. I can go out to our vineyard in the Santa Rosa Plain neighborhood, right in the middle of the valley itself. And you know, in the mornings it can be quite cold. In the afternoons it can be quite warm. So you know, you've got a lot of little nooks and crannies within these neighborhoods, as far as, you know, if you get up on some hillsides versus a little dip, and then you have frost problems down below. So it is highly variable, I guess, is the point that I want to make. From what I see making wine around the Russian River, mostly for us it's focused in that belly right in the middle of the Santa Rosa Plains, but also in the western or the middle reach area, which is up on the Russian River as it comes southwards before it bends out towards the ocean. Those places are warmer, you know, towards the east and towards the north are warmer. And so I sense the richness in those wines and the volume in those wines, and you know, kind of the spice characteristics, I think, come out especially up on the middle reach. I sense that volume in Megan's wine in the Walt, you know, and as you mentioned, Megan, that's got that warmer end of that valley, so that rings true to me. And in the Goldeneye, you know, to me it was leaner, and so that and the fruit tones, actually I found blueberry in both of those wines. So to me, I'm kind of thinking there's a whole lot of blueberry up in Anderson Valley. No expert on Anderson Valley, but I'm getting that today on both of those wines. But the Goldeneye to me is leaner in a beautiful way. The acidity is more prominent. That's something I see out in the Sebastopol Hills wines and in southern and western region of the Russian River. So Rod planted grapes here back in 1968, which is kind of on the early end for sure. Mm-hmm, and then Davis Bynum as well, you know, came over and made the first single vineyard Russian River Pinot back in '73 from the Rocchioli fruit up the road. It wasn't that, you know, probably other pioneers were making single vineyard wines, but he labeled it as such anyway on the bottle, and just kind of, I mean, it's 10 years before the appellation was made, and just things were just kind of shaken, and you know, they were two of the pioneers around here, so it was kind of cool to hear some of the old stories, you know, about the old days.
Well, and I when I very first moved out here, I was able to meet Davis Bynum just briefly, and it just was an incredible honor, because I really, again, as you're saying, you know, Rodney Strong, the man, and Davis Bynum really helped establish fine winemaking in Sonoma County, and especially Pinot. And I think it's good historically for people to know that, you know, well into the end of the 60s, it was still a lot of field blend, head trained old vines through Sonoma County. And it's not been until more recently that Pinot Noir started to really take a stronghold. And again, in Russian River Valley has been one of the most historically important areas for for that purpose. So now let's go ahead and look at the wine slide for the Rodney Strong wine. And my understanding is that this is from your own estate vineyard though, right, Greg?
No, actually, it's a blend. There is some from
It is
our
a
own
blend.
estate, and then there's a blend. Most of it is from offsite. We do a lot of estate fruit for our Davis Bynum brand. Yes, some single
Right.
vineyard and clonal wines from our Davis Bynum brand. From
Great.
our
And
estate.
then my understanding too is that in terms of winemaking, it's 14 months in 32% New French. Is that right?
I think that's close. My notes showed about 11 months. Yeah, and about
Okay.
same oak percentage, but maybe slightly less. I mean, I could be off in my own notes. I was looking to double check this morning, but
Right.
I thought it was 11. It could be 14. Vintage
Okay.
to vintage, it's in that neighborhood. It's
Yeah.
approaching right around a year. But yeah,
Well,
right around a third new oak.
Well,
And so
and it's I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, it's about a dozen different vineyards. Although there's two prominent ones, and one's on. They're both Middle Reach neighborhood vineyards. There's a lot of Pomar clone, which shows a lot of earthier tones and leather and some savoriness and umami. And I think in both of these wines, it's really carrying through, especially coming after the two Anderson Valley wines. I think our Rodney Strong, the style of our Rodney Strong Russian River Pinot leans towards the savory characters. I think you find some of the cherry and the red fruit that can be a hallmark of Russian River wines as well. Certainly, there are Pinots out here that have a lot of fresh fruit tones. I think those are in the cooler parts of the Russian River, and the warmer parts, I think it leads more towards the spice. But not always. It depends on the soil too. There's obviously a range. There's sandy soils, the Gold Ridge, and there's these clay loams. So mostly what we're growing on is clay loams or sandy clay loams, and in the warmer areas. But these two vineyards anyway lend a huge impact, and they are with the warmth. The acid will drive down. The fruit tones will get ripe. I think it gets plummy. I think it gets, a little bit going back to my Grammy and the fruit leather, I think it goes back towards like dried plum, that kind of thing. But it solidly, to me, leans on kind of a leaf litter, earthiness, some leather, toasted marshmallow, coming maybe from both the oak and the wine, but things like that.
I think it's a great reminder though too. Sometimes when we learn something like grid tasting, we tend to start to think spice notes only come from oak or from stems, but actually growing conditions can really instill a kind of natural spice element in the fruit itself, depending, and so that's part of why the more we can push into trying to understand a region, we can read a wine more clearly as we're able to do that, to see, oh no, this isn't just oak or this isn't just stems. This is actually coming from the natural conditions of the place. And I think we really see that with this particular wine. Paul, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, as you taste the Rodney Strong and we're looking at Russian River Valley. Do you want to comment?
You were talking about, the flora in different areas. Like up north, you got a lot more redwood. You get those, that's all around those vineyards. All the way really down to like Santa Cruz Mountains, you have a lot of redwoods and you get that kind of earthiness and that savory. It's really good. I love it. That's kind of where I started making Pinot, is in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So I get that earthiness to it and I love it. There's a difference in the 16 and the 17. Thank you for sending me both of them. I thought the 17 had a little more, there's a little more fruit popping on it. Had some really nice round structure, maybe a little higher alcohol. I'm not sure if you have the same heat spike we did in 2017.
I think the whole state had that heat spike. Yeah.
But both really good. And I always get, something from Russian River. I always get texturally, like on the finish, like the citrus note. I don't know where it comes through or what it is, but I always kind of get the citrus note to it, on the acidity.
Well, here it's almost like orange oil.
Mm-hmm.
It's like in that mid-range of citrus. It's avoiding the sharpness, and it's a little just like warmer, mid-tone citrus for me, kind of an orange element, rather than like grapefruit, which can be really
yeah, like
or lemon,
peel.
which can be more acidic. It's more mid-tone. Yeah,
Yeah,
Megan.
I think of it having like a lot of potpourri kind of thing going on, citrus peel, yeah, and just all those other elements. Yeah, it's kind of a fun thing in the Russian River, and honestly, sometimes within a stone's throw, you just don't know. Honestly, if it just you go over just a little lump, or you're on a hillside or whatever. But certainly, if you change soil types, I feel like you want to ripen. I don't know. For me, the grapes that we're picking from the Green Valley area, which is cooler, there's a lot better drainage in those sandy soils, and I like the fruit tones that really pop in those wines, and the acid that you get from the cooler region. And it seems like the wine wants to be made was superimposing on the vineyard, but wants to be like riper. We pick it riper actually in the cooler areas, and we pick it, a little less ripe, a little lower bricks anyway in the warmer regions. So, the different textures and flavors you get from those areas, I think can be pretty widespread. But overall, I think in the Russian River, if I had to put a very generic stamp on it, I think there's generous body, a generous amount of just richness in the wines comparatively, especially if I were to compare to Bordeaux, Willamette Valley, and Central Otago, but those would be very cool regions. Up and down the coast of California, you might say similar things, but I don't always find it to be entirely true. I find a lot of generous richness in the wines from Santa Rita Hills, and the Anderson Valley wines where it's warmer. So, and then that stamp of reddish fruit, and you mentioned the citrus. Yeah, there's this kind of an other non-fruit element that I think enters into Russian River wines generally as well.
The thing for me too about Russian River is that you can have that kind of rich flavor, but somehow the wine always floats in the mouth. Sometimes if you have a richer wine, it really presses into the palate, and somehow Russian River just kind of hovers. It gets this kind of mid-tone hovering element, even when there's spice and richer notes to it. But before we move into talking about the Central Coast, Megan, I wanted to ask, having come from us talking about Anderson Valley in the north, and now we're looking at the Russian River Valley and Rodney Strong, or anything that really stands out to you tasting this wine?
I think this wine is beautiful. I mean, it's so layered and nuanced. We've talked a lot about maybe slightly riper, but I think it has a real spherical quality on the mid palate. It's so lush, and then it's got this vibrant, almost mouth-watering acidity on the finish, which brings an element of freshness and lift, which for me is very typical of Pinot from Russian River, but really floral, really effusive. It's just a beautiful wine.
Great.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we've been talking about the North Coast, and we'll certainly comment on the North Coast more, but we're going to now really turn to digging into the Central Coast. And the last two sessions we have talked about various parts of the Central Coast, and as we've seen, it's a really long, incredibly varied, diverse region. And so we tried to pick 3 wines that get into different kind of subzones of the Central Coast than we've talked about so far. So Celeste, if you would go ahead and pull up the Central Coast map. We have now, actually, we decided to start with broadly speaking California, because now this map, we don't expect you to be able to see all the details, but we chose to go ahead and include it because you'll actually see all those little black spots and are numbering all the different AVAs of California. So look at how there are so many different certified growing areas of California. The first recognized AVA in California was in 1981. So again, relatively recent, but already we've been able to identify so many unique growing zones. And we're going to now look at one of the smallest in the state. And I wanted to be sure everyone can figure out where in the state we're talking about. So Celeste is going to point us to the Mount Harlan AVA, which is part of the Central Coast. And it is, again, we're really zoomed out here, so I don't expect you to get all the detail, but you can see it's about halfway up the length of California, directly east from the town of Monterey, but in inland mountains. So it's a high elevation area, and we can zoom into the next map that Mike can help us talk through. But before I ask Mike to talk us through this map a little bit, I want to highlight, notice the 2 key areas that are mentioned here, Limestone Quarry and Limestone Peak. part of what's so unique about Mount Harlan as a growing region and as an AVA is that it is really dominated by limestone. And something people don't really, people often do not realize is that we actually do have limestone dotted all around different parts of California. But part of what's unique about Mount Harlan as an AVA is that it's one of the few spots where we have Pinot planted in limestone. A lot of the other areas that have limestone are comparatively warmer, but because Mount Harlan is actually quite high in elevation, the climate and comes together nicely for Pinot with the limestone for Pinot. So it's really quite a unique expression and growing region for California. And so today we're looking at Calera, which really developed this area. And Mike has been working with Calera first as assistant winemaker and now as lead winemaker. So do you want to just talk us through some of the details of this map a little bit more, Mike?
Sure. So first of all, Mount Harlan actually sits on the Gavilan Mountain Range. Gavilan Mountain Range really is a short little chain that runs probably about 100 miles that separates really San Benito County, which we are in, and Monterey County. It was important to note that, Josh Jensen planted the first original vineyards in 1975 in search of limestone. It was after doing short stint in Burgundy, and his buddies over there told him look for limestone, and that was the most important key to him was limestone prior to thinking about coastal influence. But along this Gavilan Range, you have a whole slew of limestone that runs through it, and that peak that you're looking at right there actually is said to hold about a 3 million ton chunk of limestone. So everything's really planted around that area. Most of the topsoil there is decomposed granite. And the elevations you can see are planted between 22 to 2,500 feet. And I know, we've now both winemakers that have talked, we talked about those diurnal shifts. I don't think we're as dramatic as sometimes the Anderson Valley, where I've heard they can be like 80 degrees. But we do have those diurnal shifts because of our elevation. So we might be, 80, 90 degrees during the day, which feels really hot being up there in that elevation, but cool off to 50 degrees in the night, or by morning. And we also, on the last map, you see how our proximity to the Monterey Bay will come in and sweep in. You'll get the morning fogs. Today we're foggy, just like Paul is over there. But we'll get the morning fogs, and by about 2 to 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we just get this howling wind that comes sweeping in through us to cool everything off right around 2 or 3 o'clock, which is perfect time. Like to see those things. You can see there's one vineyard missing on the backside, but we have 6 single vineyards planted around here. And, back in 1975, it was kind of odd to think about, having that many vineyards on your own. I think it was popular for people to have, estate wines and then maybe a reserve wine. And so it was really hard to sell, these vineyards in this fashion. But, it was truly modeled kind of more after, this is a very specific site. And within this specific site, we have even more specific sites. So we wanted to focus on these individual vineyards. So the Mills vineyard you see there was a later planting, 1984. It was our only Pinot Noir vineyard on its own roots. So, and clonal material, it's all the same. We call it the Calera clone. It's really a field selection. I know we were talking about, early plantings in California where there was, there was Pinot around from the early 1900s, right? And there was probably a lot of people had real Pinot Noir, but at the time, I think the government was allowing people to plant Gamay as Pinot Noir. So you saw a lot of vineyards around this area as, being called Pinot Noir, but was really Gamay. Josh wanted to make sure he had true Pinot Noir at the time. And there were obviously several other vineyards around here that had true Pinot Noir, but I think it was important for him to plant those. So the Mills vineyard is as you can see with those vineyards, they all have really, really unique slopes, unique exposure. The Mills Vineyard has a kind of a south-facing slope on its own roots. Our typical yields are less than a ton to the acre, which is really not feasible for most people that want to make money from doing this, you know, being in this business. I find, you know, for the winemaking, we've really stuck with a very traditional winemaking from the beginning of the days. I mean, Josh Jensen worked in Burgundy in the early 70s, and this is days before destemmers and stuff like that. And so Josh just assumed that, you know, we're going to go and do this whole cluster, and it worked out for us. It doesn't work out everywhere. I mean, we make Central Coast Pinot from a lot of different vineyards throughout the Central Coast, and some vineyards really, as I was saying earlier, tend to give you, you know, more of that herbaceous veggie, almost canned veggie characteristics from these things. What we find is being up in the elevation, we have a very long growing season. This Mills is typically probably not picked out until mid-October. Another thing is with this heritage clone, I feel like we have a lot more exposure to the rachis. So with that rachis being, you know, you're not going to see a full lignification, but you definitely get a ripeness in the rachis as you would with the grapes. So that helps out a lot. And I think, you know, we really lucked out with that thing. So we basically bring it in, whole cluster ferment, usually about 2 weeks, press it off, goes to barrel, sees about 30% new oak, all native yeast fermentations. And we'll age them for about 18 months. So, you know, with this vineyard, I find that you're getting more of, I get more of the earth tones from this vineyard than we'd had in the past. And I think being now on its own roots from 84, the vineyard's struggling a little bit more than the rest of our vineyards. It's looking for water. It needs, you know, it needs that kind of stuff. But I feel like it's giving off like secondary characteristics of earth tones. Some years, you know, with the lower yields, I'll get more of that black fruit, but typically now it's kind of more getting into that red fruit, but you get, you know, that mushroom character with it. And I think just, you know, more of a herbal notes.
I love your reminder too. Like sometimes we get caught up in wanting to know every single technique and choice that was made in a wine, you know, and kind of assume, oh, that's going to tell us something about what the wine is like. But actually a lot of those choices are because of simple logistics, you know, and just like what equipment's available, how fast the fruit came in that year, when a tank opened up or didn't, you know, all these crazy logistics that have to be dealt with every year. One of the, like as a historical side note, you know, Hanzel up in Sonoma County is really one of California's truly important historic wineries for Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And well into the 90s, they did all whole cluster fermentation because their equipment was so rough that it broke up the stems. Trying to destem the fruit to get just the fruit from the clusters actually broke up the stems so severely that to destem made a more tannic, rougher wine than to just use whole cluster. And so they eventually got a better destemmer, and they started to step away from whole cluster and realized, wait a minute, we want some back, you know? And so it was like just a quirk of history on equipment and logistics that they had to use whole cluster. How you use whole cluster can vary significantly, but I just, you know, Josh's experience, that's what he was familiar with based on equipment at the time. And then he, you know, you've continued to enjoy it. But, you know, again, Greg, we commented earlier, you have a lot of experience with whole cluster yourself. And so I'd love to hear what stands out to you tasting the Calera.
Everything is Calera Pinot, you know, it's like playing tennis with Serena Williams, you know, it's everything that I could ever want, you know. And I love seeing the chat and people are talking about really cool things. There's floral, there's other stuff. There's something so sincere and elementary and pure about this that like I get chills. I mean, it's really emotional, you know. And I remember it takes me back the first thing actually that came to mind, it took me back to late December of '92 at Winecast Restaurant when I had Clara for the first time at 87 Jensen. And that's why we do what we do here. I mean, that winery informed Brewer Clifton. You know, it's like, it's everything. So smelling that, it's so beautiful to have like all of the evolution, refinement that Mike and the team and everyone have kind of brought to that system, while still like holding so true to like what Calera has always been for the better part of 50 years. It's a very, very special wine.
Well, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I appreciate those words, Greg. But I feel at this point, I was working with Josh since 2007. And from the historical standpoint of what Calera is, it's hard for me to ever think about straying away from the traditional methods that we've used. To me, I feel like, this is a piece of history that needs to remain intact as what was foreseen from the beginning.
It really speaks though to how with some wineries, legacy is such a crucial piece of their identity, when we have these kinds of layers of winemakers in one session, like you really get to start to uncover that and hear that, because again, like this inspiration Greg just mentioned really speaks to the importance of legacy in that sense. So Greg Morthole, I'd love to hear too, we were up in the North Coast and now we've stepped into a very specific part of the Central Coast. So what really stands out for you in tasting this particular wine?
Yeah. My mic on okay again?
Yes, you sound great.
Yeah, perfect. Mike, I'm loving this wine. The thing I get in this wine that stood out for me right away, and I went through the wines, in order, and I went to the Calera, and what came out to me was sage and lavender is really beautiful. And I know somebody wrote in petrichor, Heather over there in the comments wrote petrichor. I love that. And minerality, was one of my notes too. And so there's these things that I don't see a whole lot of up here in the Russian River. And it's just outstanding in this wine and very different. And I love that. I think there's the Calera wines I've had in the past. I found that if I drank them really young, the tannins would kind of come out a little bit, and they needed like one more year than the Russian River counterpart at the same vintage. And this wine, I find the tannins to be a little more melted than this is a 16. So the tannins in this wine are perhaps a little more melted and a little rounder than I've experienced in my experience with Calera wines in the past. But I love it for all those things. I still find the tannins to, I don't know, I think have this kind of burgundy like just a really nice tactile sense to them that I find in wines grown in those same type of soils in Burgundy. So maybe there's something to it. I would like to think.
I actually think so. One of the most life-changing, in terms of wine at least, life-changing experiences I had, I spent 10 days in Cahors in France, so slightly inland southwestern France. And it's the region is all limestone, but also all Malbec. And it was mind-boggling to spend 10 days just tasting Malbec grown in limestone, because I kept seeing all those parallels, that it wasn't the variety, it was the growing conditions in those soils. It's like there's a parallel to how you're describing that tannin profile here with completely different varieties in the same soils. You can get those parallels, and it's really profound to get that kind of palate exposure, so thank you for that. The other thing too, last week we spent a lot of time mentioning how, Wente has had such a profound influence. Their clonal selections for Chardonnay really has actually influenced the whole world. It's gone, around the planet and really taken hold in all sorts of places. And here in California, Calera is one of those heritage clones for Pinot that has really had such an important influence and can be found around the state. And that winemakers specifically reach for when they're establishing new vineyards. Calera is one of those key heritage selections that people really reach for, and because it has such unique growing conditions or expression, but also like palate expression once you're making it into the wine. So let's go ahead, Celeste, and pull up we saw the broad California map just now, and we're going to look at the Central Coast map now. We were just looking at Mount Harlan, right, to the east of Monterey Bay. And now we want to zone into a very specific part of the Monterey AVA. And so again, as we saw last week, this red outline is the Monterey AVA. And notice how really, really long and narrow it is, because it is actually an AVA defined by that valley. And so we've spoken over and over again about the importance of these coastal facing valleys. So just like what we were talking about today in Anderson Valley and last week in other parts of the state, that further, the southern part of this particular valley is the one that's furthest from the ocean. But notice how the northernmost boundary of Monterey AVA actually faces exactly onto the mouth of Monterey Bay. And we talked about last time how there's a deep canyon there in Monterey Bay. And that the reason that matters is because, again, that cold ocean current is coming down from the north. When it hits that underwater canyon, it sort of pools up and it locks in some of that cold ocean influence right there in Monterey Bay. And so then as temperatures increase in the southern parts of Monterey, that valley there, that's Monterey AVA, it really aggressively pulls in that cold maritime influence. And so as we'll hear from Paul in a minute, the fog is really crucially impactful in all of Monterey AVA. But if we zoom into the next slide, we can see we saw this last week too, but notice we've been able to break down the kind of nested AVAs within Monterey AVA. And you'll see there's just this series of AVAs that go the whole length of the valley. And because of that, how incredibly long that AVA is and the valley is, you get an outrageously strong daily wind through the whole area. And it just zooms across these growing regions and really, really profoundly impacts growing conditions. So last week we were able to talk some about Arroyo Seco, which you can see there, but today we're going to focus in just a tiny bit north of that onto the Santa Lucia Highlands. And so Paul, I would love to hear a little bit more, Santa Lucia Highlands, benchland soils, but notice again how long and narrow it is. And Paul, I know you work with vineyards that really cover that range of Santa Lucia Highlands. And if you could talk us through the differences north, middle, and south of that area.
Yeah, so like she was saying, the Salinas Valley is it's really long. It almost stretches all the way down to Paso Robles, and down there in the southern part of Monterey and Paso, the temperatures get to like 100 degrees. The valley itself is banked by the Gavilan range, which where Mike is on the east side, and then the Santa Lucia mountain range on the west. And the Santa Lucia Highlands is actually, if you're driving through the middle of the Salinas Valley, you look up to the west, it looks like a bench. And it's very consistent. It's not like rolling hills, as you might see up in the northern California. It's very consistent. The soils are they're all alluvial. So basically that mountain range was formed by tectonic shifting of plates and boosted up, and then over millions of years, just an alluvial fan. And on that fan, the soils are really well drained. It's granite based, sandy, gravelly loams. In the northern part of the AVA itself is about 18 miles long. And in the northern part of the AVA, closer to the ocean, you don't see as many rocks. As you move further south, you'll see more rock. But regardless, it's just super well drained, deep soil. There's no hard pan. It can rain, an inch or two. Well, we barely got that this year, but you could drive on the property the same day it rains. It's just so well drained versus, if I went down on the valley floor where it's really like heavy clay, great for growing produce or leafy greens, you'd sink up to your door. So as you move north in the AVA, closer to the ocean, most of the AVA is planted Pinot, about 3,500 acres. And then there's about 2,500 acres of Chardonnay and maybe 1,000 acres of other varieties, Rhone varieties planted. But in the northern part of the AVA with Pinot Noir, you tend to get a more elegant, lighter in color, lighter in structure. You're seeing more fog burning off later in the morning in the northern part of the AVA. And as you move further south, the sun pops out a little bit earlier, usually around 11 a.m. And then you have about 2-3 hours of photosynthesis or sugar being pumped into the grapes during the growing season until the wind picks up, just like Mike was referring to in the Hollister area. So it'll start ramping up, and the wind gets so strong out there that there's, it's notorious. There's a gas station in Soledad where like doors just get ripped off their hinges as people are filling up their tanks. It's just really brutal wind. And what will happen is the photosynthesis will shut down around 3 p.m. because the wind is just going so fast over the leaves, it can't keep up. So it'll shut down, and the grapes will be hanging there. And it's kind of like just hanging in the sun, like my skin, it just gets darker and darker. And you get this phenolic buildup in the Pinot Noir. And you'll end up with, especially in the southern part of the AVA, with these like really voluptuous types of Pinot Noir that it's like, oh my God, if you're not careful, it can almost taste like, a Syrah or a Cab. It just gets so intense if you let it hang for too long. So this 2017 that we have here, this was a very non-typical year for us. We, usually it's like, oh yeah, we're out in the vineyard, we're like, oh yeah, let's pick this block and bring it in this block, and it's all like just and love and fun, out in the vineyards. But 2017, we hit 115 degrees a Labor Day weekend, and it was like full bore, just boom, 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 get everything off as fast as you can, because it was a grape storm, just trying to get everything off. So really challenging vintage for us, but this wine itself is actually a really good representation of the AVA itself, as we have vineyards both in the northern part and the southern and middle part. So it's kind of like a blend of the AVA, and about 20 different clones in there, and I think it's about a third new oak, something like that. But yeah.
Well, and we were just talking about whole cluster, but this is an example of a fully destemmed wine, right?
Yeah. So every couple of years, maybe I need to have Mike and Greg teach me how to do it, but every couple of years I try whole cluster. It's just a disaster. I don't know how to do it, or maybe I need to cook the stems. I don't know.
Yeah, but it could be what Mike was getting at. It could be what Mike was getting at earlier too, that it really, some regions the fruit grows in a way it works, and some places it just doesn't. My impression, based on previous combos you and I have had, my impression is that the stems stay really green where you are. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a really long growing season, but we don't really get lignification in the stems, and it's kind of like the seed. I always like, I like tasting the seed. Our seeds always lignify, but if they don't, and you pop that seed in your mouth when it's still green, it's really like bitter and just doesn't taste good. And I'm like, God, I want it to. So we're always waiting for that seed to lignify, and you pop it in, the seed lignified in your mouth, it's nutty. And it's the same thing with a stem. I pop a green stem in my mouth, I'm like, Jesus, this sucks. I don't want it in my wine. But some parts of California, it works,
In France, one of the things they say is like some sites, the seeds and stems are digestible. They actually like feel good to your body.
Yeah.
And that if you're going to whole cluster, they need to be digestible, so, and sometimes it's like really rough in the mouth. It's not digestible, But Megan, you've done a lot of work in this area as well, and, Monterey AVA, but specifically Santa Lucia Highlands. So, speaking as you taste this wine, but also other comments you want to make on this area as a growing region?
Yeah, I'll start by saying I've never had a successful whole cluster fermentation from Santa Lucia Islands either, Paul.
That's not you.
I can't do it. So we make wine from 2 vineyards in the Santa Lucia Highlands, Rosellas, which is on the northern end, and then Sierra Mar, which is southern end and higher elevation, and very, very different expressions of Pinot Noir from such a very small area. The wines that are closer to the Monterey Bay tend to be more floral, rose petal, elegant, bright cherry fruit for me. And then as you get into the southern end of the Santa Lucia Highlands, there's so much power and concentration and dark fruit and earthiness. It's really fascinating, the diversity that comes out of the Highlands. I really love working with those wines, and this is a beautiful expression. You get the freshness and the floral coming from the vineyards that you have in the northern part, but yet there's a power and an elegance and a roundness and a great length on the palate with a vibrancy and a freshness. That acidity for me is always so present in Santa Lucia Highlands and is a hallmark for me.
Well, absolutely.
But this is a beautiful wine, Paul.
Well, and if you just go back to Paul's description of the course of a day in Santa Lucia Highlands, you know, you have fog into mid or late morning, which means the vines are not getting direct sunlight. At best, they're getting diffuse light right through the fog. And you have a few hours of clear skies. And then by mid-afternoon, the wind kicks up. And in fact, so intensely, you can't, I always say you can't barbecue outside and don't wear a skirt, you know. But the reason that the wind really has a big impact is because, again, the vine leaves will literally close down and turn away from the wind, because the breathing apparatus in the leaf, the stomata, if it's facing the wind, it would dehydrate the entire vine. So as a, you know, if you think about like, if you like, when was the last time you put your head out the car window while somebody else was driving like a dog? It's actually really hard to breathe, right? The vine goes through the same thing. And so the vine turns its leaves away from the wind, closes down, stops its respiration. That does two things. It retains natural acidity. So you get that signature acidity like Megan was talking about in really windy regions, but it also slows down the ripening. And so it's just a super interesting contrast and really stands out about this region. So Mike, though, you know, Santa Lucia Highlands is not all that far from where you're located, but the growing conditions are radically different. And again, you're dealing with whole cluster. This is destemmed. What stands out to you as you taste this wine?
Well, first of all, the wine is fantastic. I really like it. It reminds me of Santa Lucia Highlands, like a great prototype for everybody to be tasting here. I mean, I think it has that cherry cola almost deal to it. Really balanced, very sexy, good texture. I've worked with these vineyards before, maybe not these specific vineyards, but we worked with a lot of Han vineyards for years. And I could never successfully do whole cluster on these. And I think really it's about wind there. You know, the vines shut down. You know, and a lot of these things are fuller clustered. Santa Lucia Highlands is a tough place. I've seen a couple people do it and be successful with it, but it's too far and few between. Great vineyards though. I miss working with these vineyards.
Yeah,
Come on back, Mike. Come on back, dude.
You give me a better price.
We'll do business negotiations after the webinar is officially over. Okay, so for anybody that wants to stay on and watch that happen, we're going to be doing that next. Okay, so let's keep moving down the Central Coast. You might remember again, the Central Coast, incredibly long and growing area, really goes all the way from the San Francisco Bay in the north, all the way down to the turn in the continent, which is where Santa Barbara County shows up. So Celeste, if we could pull up the Santa Barbara County map. We went ahead, and I love how someone keeps a phantom hand keeps sneaking in to there it was again at Rodney Strong, Greg's video feed at Rodney Strong. Some phantom hand keeps showing up and stealing wine, I'm assuming to taste along with us. But okay, so we went ahead and we pulled the Santa Barbara County map because you can see where Santa Rita Hills is located there in the Santa Barbara County map. Again, that's the southernmost reach of the Central Coast. And notice how the Santa Barbara County is actually bordered by the ocean on two sides. But that said, that southern boundary of the Santa Barbara County, it's facing the ocean. But notice how that, again, those really dark green lines, those are mountain ridges with forests on top. Now, this is something we want to really make sure and emphasize here, though. Notice where those mountain ridges with forest on top are located. They're all on the eastern side of the Santa Barbara County. What that means is if you look we outlined only 3 of the AVAs within Santa Barbara County, but that includes the easternmost AVAs of Santa Barbara County. Notice they are all entirely west of those mountain ridges. That means they are fully exposed to that cold Pacific current we keep talking about. And so yet again, Santa Barbara County is profoundly influenced, certainly by fog, parts of it also by wind. And at different areas, we get a big focus on elevation as well. So Santa Rita Hills is a really, again, you know, I mentioned earlier, Russian River Valley helped show the world that California can make great Pinot. But the truth is that Santa Rita Hills really did that as well. The area started getting planted in the 1970s. It didn't become an AVA until 2001. But we're really lucky to have Greg Brewer with us here today, because he really has helped define and understand the region. He's worked with vineyards throughout the AVA. As I mentioned, has been working with vineyards from the area since the 1990s. And so really has witnessed the growth and rise of Santa Rita Hills and Santa Barbara County in general. And so, you know, Greg, what else do you want us to really understand about Santa Rita Hills as a growing region?
Well, you know, and thank you for saying that you're all lucky that I'm on the panel. Don't say that yet, but thank you. That was a gracious thing to introduce me with. I think the key thing to keep in mind with Santa Rita Hills is, you know, it's freezing down here, you know, and we have this very long season. So as we've talked about for the past hour and 22 minutes, you know, the water coming down, you know, from your homeland, you know, of Alaska, right? And so you've got this freezing cold Alaska water that comes down and it kind of starts spitting out right behind me where we are. And it's no joke, you know, I think Santa Barbara, when people think about Santa Barbara, they think Oprah and royalty, and that's true. I mean, Santa Barbara is nice, I'm not gonna lie, but it faces south and it's a very different voice of the ocean.
Yeah, the town of Santa Barbara, right?
Yeah. Our
versus the
ocean
county.
out here,
yeah,
right. Our ocean here is a different animal. You know, you don't hold hands and have picnics and whatever out here. You know, it's a savage ocean. It's a very hostile ocean. And so, and because our valley opens up due west onto it, you know, it's like 6 miles from where I am right now. It's like a mouth, you know, breathing in this influence. And we've talked about that this whole seminar, which is so critical. I mean, the ocean ultimately informs all of these wines in a different way, you know, and I think that's such a beautiful common thread that we all share, you know. And so that's key, you know. And then as far as, you know, this appellation goes, you know, when I started, there were a handful of vineyards here, 4 or 5, about 300 or 400 acres. And so it was very precious. It was very finite. And the results of those vineyards were stunning. And so, you know, when I came in, my timing was great, you know, because I had the influence and the inspiration from some of the others that I mentioned, you know. And essentially this whole project was like, well, if, you know, Bert Williams and Josh Jensen had a love child in Santa Barbara, you know, that listened to Depeche Mode and wore eyeliner, you know, it would be me and Steve Clifton. And so, and that's really how this project was born. It was like taking like those elements of those 2 wineries in particular and like mashing them up in this landscape. And so that's been part of the thing. But something else about Santa Rita, you know, specifically, it's a blessing and a curse, is that, you know, our aperture of picking here is massive, right? Because our weather never changes. Like we get no rain, right? The soils are very desolate. It's sand, there's plankton fossil. It's very solitary. It's very empty. It's very desolate, like the landscape is. And, you know, it's basically 12 months a year. The low temperature is 45 or 50. The high temperature is like 70-ish, right? And so our picking parameter for Pinot alone, you know, for me, normally it's 6 weeks for picking. You know, it's like September 1 to mid-October. And so you've got like all the time in the world to kind of slowly navigate through things. And there are colleagues that elect to pick early. And that's cool because you still had a pretty long season. And so you can have development in a more kind of, you know, perkier pomegranate Bing cherry vibe. And then because our fall weather is so predictable, for those of us that hang out in like a, you know, kind of quote unquote naughtier sandbox later in the season, we can still maintain freshness, right? Because we can have the weight that the alcohol provides, yet the precision and freshness because of the ocean that's right here.
Right. Well, so just to speak to a question that's come up, and since you've just mentioned the kind of picking window, like Santa Barbara County as a whole has actually one of the longest growing seasons in North America. But also because of that, as soon as you have a really long growing season, that means it's a really slow development over time. And as soon as you have that slowed down pace, you have a bigger window of choice for when to pick, which is what Greg was just speaking about. But let's just quickly run up the coast. Paul, like what would be a typical picking time of year for Pinot there in Santa Lucia Highlands?
Typically, we start mid-September. When I first started here, like 19 years ago, it was like the beginning of September, but it seems like it's getting pushed back every year.
Right.
Yeah, middle of September.
And then Greg in Russian River Valley, what do you think the range would be?
Yeah, I'd say we are picking at the earliest. If you're looking at super cold season, we could be picking mid-August. That's unusual, but pretty typical would be the end of the third week of August, and the very in a excuse me, did I say cool season? In a warm season, we'd picking mid August. In a cool season, we'd be picking maybe very early September.
Right, cool. And then Mike, how about there in Mount Harlan?
Well, we have a wide range of picking. Usually we're a week or two after Labor Day, so it's mid-September, but we'll go all the way to October. And that could be true for one single vineyard we have here, but typically we don't finish until the end of October. But you have to realize that we also have some northern facing vineyards. And
well, and that's the thing, like slopes and elevations start to really inform when you pick as well, when you're up at that high. And then Megan, how about upper in Anderson Valley? What do you see?
Because of where we are in the Anderson Valley, it's usually can be as early as late August, but typically it's right after Labor Day. And then we'll go to the second or third week in September. But I used to work with Savoy Vineyard, which is further out towards the coast. And that was usually September 15th and could be as late as October. So there's a pretty wide range there.
The thing that's great about highlighting picking decisions on one variety in different parts of the state is if you're listening into the dates, you start to hear how profoundly varied California is for growing conditions and the ripening windows that invokes. But so Greg, coming back to Santa Rita Hills, one of the other things too is there, as you were starting to mention, there's really a huge range of soils in that area. And I know that a good number of the vineyards, and I think many of the vineyards that are included in this particular wine, the soils are really sandy. And there were kind of quick comments earlier about how that can really transform the aromatics on a wine. And it sort of, in my experiences, it really shifts the tannin profile of a wine as well. Could you comment on that briefly?
Yeah, I mean, for me, what I've seen is around here, if there's a little bit more like stuff in the soil, that it substantiates the wine. It kind of like gives it more bottom end. And then sand, from here anyway, sand and Pinot lends more kind of higher, pretty floral, like aromatic stuff. And that was interesting, listening to the other Greg about, some of the sandy clay loam sites, and I think in that wine too, there's that neat juxtaposition where it's like Russian River, like depth and core and intensity. But I would suspect that the sandy nature of some of those vineyards kind of keep it breathy, you know what I mean? It's again, it's that teeter-totter. And so, yeah, a lot of it's here, sand, sandy clay loam. It's all beachy. I mean, that's the bottom line. It feels very beachy that way. I mean, basically the whole corridor.
A lot of Santa Barbara County has that. Mm-hmm. So let's go ahead and look at the wine and talk about how this particular wine is made. We, again, mentioned whole cluster plays an important role here, and we'll have Greg comment on that as well. And this is, as Paul mentioned with his Han Pinot, this is also meant to be a kind of regional expression of Santa Rita Hills as a whole, rather than a single vineyard, though there are single vineyard wines made from this area as well. So Greg, what are the other key aspects of the winemaking in this case that we should know?
Yeah, so it's very primitive, it's very barbaric, really. I mean, it's predominantly whole cluster. It's, all done in little fermenters. It's in fermenters for about 45 days. And then we press down to barrels that are right behind me, actually, but they're 15 to 25 years old. So that's one little point of departure maybe from some of the other wines. So no new oak at all. The wine that you're all having now has, been raised in barrels that I've had my entire career. And they're here. I mean, they're like old. And so that's it. It's all raised the same. It's all very neutral. Brewer Clifton is really more ritual and discipline and faith-based, more so than, anything else. And as we've, the clones with which we work the most, are 37 and 459. They work great with stems. Again, something that Mike mentioned, which is so critical, as far as, that the cluster itself is so important, like how the nature of that cluster of Calera is important as far as how they're able to raise the wines. And for us as well, the relationship of stem to fruit is important here. It's like a flesh and bone situation.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not going to take the flesh off the bone. Like the whole body has to be kind of intact and in proportion. And so all of our farming emphasis and where we plant and how we do things is all reliant on or hinges around the role of stems, because that's really the primary architecture source in this wine is found from within, kind of like I talked about with Megan's wine, because there's no new oak at all. Obviously, there's no tannin from that.
Right. So again, it's a choice about how do we want to create the framing for the fruit and flavor of the wine. And in your case,
Santa Rita can be dark as night, and they're beautiful colleagues that render wines that are dark and sexy and curvy and awesome. And for me, stems are a corset. They harness in that fruit intensity. They kind of they downplay the fruit, and at the same time they kind of lift it up because you're fermenting all those whole berries.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's that spicy tea-like soy architecture in the back of the palate, much like the role of soy on a piece of sashimi. It's like the fattiness of the fish is the richness of our fruit, and the soy is what keeps it savory and compelling. So that's the reasoning. That and like mimicking Calera. I mean, that's really this
right.
combination Calera sushi bar,
right?
And Williams, and Depeche Mode.
Right.
That's Brewer Clifton in a nutshell.
Yeah, the eyeliner needs to come back though. I'd love to see it.
But it's right. Yeah, along with the powder for my head. Yeah, for sure.
No, but I love that point though, that stems can take the role of creating space in the flavors of a wine. So they like create layers and space, but again, notice how in your case, the choice to do whole cluster is not just about the growing region, but actually the plant material and the farming have to point towards the goal of using whole cluster so that all of it lines up. Because we talk about how Pinot is so expressive of place, but one of the things we often fail to say when we're describing that is how we don't just mean in the glass, we actually mean on the vine. So there's a huge range of clonal selections for Pinot Noir that people can choose from. Each of them shows up differently, and then that's adjusted by where they're grown, and then how the farming is done really hugely impacts the health of the vine and the balance of the vine as well. And so, Megan, I know you also work with vineyards right in that area of Santa Rita Hills, very close to where Greg has many of his vineyards. And so what stands out to you as you taste this wine?
I mean, for me, this wine is just absolutely a magical expression of Santa Rita Hills. It's so fresh and vibrant and lifted. You capture that beautiful earthy quality. It's I need some lessons, Greg, please. So yeah, I mean, we work with Clopepi Vineyard, which is very close, almost right next door. I find the same freshness, the same vibrancy. For me, the soils play a very important role in Santa Rita Hills. I think both in the way that they impact the structure, the finish. There's always a minerality, it's almost a saline quality for me that I love. And then on the aromas, I think there's a nougat candy that's so present in these wines. But this is just lovely.
Well, and Greg Morthall, I'd love to hear from you too, because, Santa Rita Hills, you commented on how you're familiar with sort of the history of the North Coast. And now we've been talking through some of the history of the Central Coast as well for Pinot. But it is, I almost think of they're like absolute counterpoints, Russian River Valley on the one hand and Santa Rita Hills on the other. They've both been so historically important for Pinot in California, but they're really profoundly different, both on the vine and in the mouth, the way the wine shows up and the way the vines grow. And so having said that, Greg, you're there in Russian River. And so I just, you're tasting this wine from the opposite part of the state, opposite growing conditions in a certain sort of way, and very different wine expression as well. What stands out to you as you taste this wine?
I was thinking that maybe if things are on that kind of a normal distribution, I think they call it, bell-shaped curve, we used to say when we were in school. If things are kind of on that kind of a curve in terms of your climate, and the Santa Rita Hills is definitely, cool, very much colder as that valley opens up towards the ocean. And for us, that fog comes in, but it's through that Petaluma Gap, and it's got to come in, and then it's got to come up, especially to where we are. For some, it doesn't have to come in too far. So down there, maybe there's some similarities, but from where we are up in the heart, and comparing to Greg's wine here, I find that the wines that I've had from the Russian River down in the coldest areas are off on that edge over here, and where they've got this elevated fruit tone. So what I find in the wine is that it's got this beautiful kind of dark cherry fruit core, and maybe some plumminess, but it centers more on this really fresh fruit, not super dried fruit, and it kind of goes, but it's changed over time, and it's showing a little bit of, I don't know if garrigue is the right word, but a little bit of sage. I mean, almost not quite to the extent that the Calera has, but I'm finding a little bit of an herbal tone really deliciously weaving its way back in. Whereas at first, when I first popped the bottles and I even went through them here, the fruit was speaking to me. But I do find that it's texturally a really beautiful wine, more taut, a little more of an ager for me. Not hard by any means, but it's got a nice little sandy texture to the tannins, and I see that in the coldest climate of the Russian River too. So not vineyards that we're really directly picking from generally, and to me, so there's that bell-shaped curve of colder, warmer, and then super warm, and I think the fruit tones over on the coldest side can be really high. And then as you get warmer, they can die off. They can die off completely. They can get a lot darker in tone as well. But I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it's great. Yeah, thank you. We do need to start wrapping up, but before we do that, Paul, I'd love to hear from you, like having tasted across this selection of wines, and getting to, of course, taste and talk about from Monterey AVA, but then also look south and look north, just like the Pinot lineup from today. What stands out to you? What are some of your takeaways?
I definitely learned some things today. Thank you guys.
Yay!
I thought there was like this between the Calera and Greg Brewer's wine, Brewer Clifton, the wines had this similarity to them, like the seamless, like just God, I don't know what it is, but it kind of rocked my world. So thank you for that.
I always love when I've been able to help do a seminar where the winemakers are like, oh my God, I learned so much. I love that. So thank you for that. And then Mike too, I'd love to ask, tasting across this lineup of 6 wines, what kind of jumped out to you?
Well, I make wines typically, Calera is known to be, the age-worthy wines. And I'm looking for, just going back to Greg's wine, I feel like, that lack of barrels, that's a gutsy move. And I really, really appreciate it, because I think we've overused wood for so long. For me, barrels have become just, they're just a carrier of a wine. But I really love tension. And I think Whole Cluster provides that tension. But, not only that, but going through all these wines, they all had very unique and I think very distinct qualities from each region. I really appreciated it. You did a great job here today. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope the attendees have seen, we really put a lot of thought into trying to deliver a real range of styles and insights in our selection of speakers and wines together. This is my last week with all of you in Canada through this series. So I really thank you for including me in this. Again, I love having the chance to speak with Canada. I will say that I suspect, since many of you in Canada are facing snow and even new snow today, that you might resent our pretending California is in any way cold. So forgive us for that. I want to point out that there in Niagara, you have to actually bury your vines for them to survive, and your growing seasons are much, much shorter. So we're talking in terms of context and contrast here. I have great admiration for a lot of the work being done in Canadian wine. It takes a tenacious person to grow in conditions like that. But again, thank you so much for including me. I want to make sure you know, please join next week. Andrea Robinson, who will be facilitating a seminar on Napa Valley Cabernet, is a fantastic educator and moderator. And so you're really in store for a treat there as well. But it's been an incredible honor to be able to do this session with all 5 of you. The work each of you do in wine in California and in Pinot Noir, I learn so much every time I have the chance to speak and taste with you. And so thank you so much for all of the insights that each of you shared. It's been a pleasure. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Great
Thank
job.
you so much, Elaine. Thank you, you incredible vintners who joined us for an amazing perspective today on California Pinot. Elaine, you can't leave without us thanking you. So on behalf of all of us here at California Wines Team Canada, a real gracious and special thank you for being with us for the past 3 weeks. We learned a ton from you and these wonderful vintners, and we cannot wait to have you all back in Canada with us next year. Let's hope these vaccine rollouts go quickly. So again, we really appreciate it, guys, for spending all the time with us today and the other vintners for the past 3 weeks. We also want to thank Celeste for great work on the map. Celeste, thank you so much. For Heather and the SIPS Toronto team for sending all the great pouches out to everyone. So thank you for that. And please, as Elaine said, join us next week, Tuesday, April 27th at 2 p.m. for the 4th and final session this California Wine Month as we explore Napa Valley Cabernet with Master Sommelier and Wine Educator Andrea Robinson. She is also a doll. Andrea is going to be joined by winemakers from Stag's Leap Wine Cellars, St. Supri, and Signorello as we taste through 6 classic Napa wines. So register for this at calwine.ca/California Wine Month. Thank you to everyone. Hope to see you next week as we wrap up this California Wine Month with some Napa Valley Cabernet in your glass. So again, thank you, Elaine. Thank you, you wonderful vintners. Stay safe, and we hope to see you soon in Canada.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Bye for now, everyone. Thank you.